Shalom, shalom, and welcome to bethariel Wednesday Bible Study, where we are already at our 34th and last study of this great book of Deuteronomy. And once again, personally, I feel that we've just scratched the surface. Today, we'll go directly to the text. We will cover the last two chapters of Deuteronomy 33, 34. The previous section was not an easy one, as it contained stern warnings and many prophecies describing the difficult history and even the difficult future of the people Israel. It must not have been easy for Moses to write about these things, especially the curses that we find in Deuteronomy 28 and those prophecies of the tribulation found in his song in Deuteronomy 32. These might have brought him to assess the work that he had done for the last 40 years and concluded that all was futile and vain, that all of this represented a marked failure in his ministry. But praise God, chapter 32 is not the end of the book. As with all the other end-time prophecies, God ends the story with a bright note when it concerned his own. And these two last chapters, God take us along with Moses right to the end of the tribulation times, past these curses and right into the Messianic times, the millennium, to witness the great blessings that he will bestow on the people of Israel. Furthermore, in this chapter, Moses is giving a global perspective of the future history. While in Deuteronomy 32, he was brought right into the 7-year tribulation times, in Deuteronomy 33, he witnesses the second actually coming of the Messiah as he is brought right again to the Messianic age. And he even sees the location of each of the 12 tribes of Israel. They are different from the ones given previously. And then, this is beautiful, Deuteronomy 34, a short chapter of 12 verses where God here gives Moses a tour of the land of Israel. Remember that he did not allow him to enter it, but better than entering it, Moses is shown all of it from where he stood. So let's begin by reading chapter 33. Let's start with verse 1.
Now this is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death.
Now, if you count the number of blessings in this chapter, you will see that there are so many. But this word blessing in here in verse 1 is singular, as one great blessing that expands into many, many others, each one being a part of the whole and each one being designed for the benefit of every tribe. As Moses will here speak about each of the tribes of Israel and how the Lord designed each of the blessings for them. These blessings of Moses contain no exhortations, no warnings. They are simply blessing. And one more time, they're given to us in a very picturesque manner by the one who was previously, if you remember, slow of speech and slow of tongue, as we read in Exodus chapter 4. But now through the Spirit of God, he's uttering some of the most beautiful words for us. Now, but before we are brought into the millennium or the Messianic age, Moses is first brought to witness the second coming of the Messiah. See the following verse. This is where we are right away brought in Deuteronomy, that is in this place. Deuteronomy 33 verses 2 to 3.
The Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand came a fiery law for them. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran.
See, here Moses witnesses the second coming of the Messiah in power. But see these three places mentioned here, Sinai, Seir, the Mount Paran, and they are all south of Jerusalem. Yet, if you remember, Zechariah situates the coming of the Messiah, the second coming, right on the Mount of Olives. Why these places here, and what is their relation with the second coming of the Messiah? How can we link these passages? Even considering these places in these two verses we just read, it is difficult to conceive how the Lord comes from Sinai and then we are told that he shines from Seir to Paran, right? Because they are far away. So one rabbi, Abarbanel, asks, since the Torah was given at Sinai and not at Seir or Paran, why are they mentioned together? They could not conceive nor explain why these places of Sinai, Seir, and Paran are here together. And rightly so. We know that the two events in Sinai and Seir with Paran are divided by thousands of years. And for us, it is clear that at Seir and Paran, it is referring actually to the second coming of the Messiah, because we read that he's coming with 10,000 of his saints, that is his angels and perhaps even believers who had passed away. And other prophets like Habakkuk and Isaiah also tell us that the Lord will come from the south, that is from Edom. We read this at the end of the book of Isaiah. For as an example, Isaiah 63, before the announcement of the new heaven and the new earth and the Messianic times, there we read,
Who is this who comes from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah, this one who is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength, I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save?
How can we make sense of all this? When it comes to God, time and space are always difficult to conceive. Does Yeshua come first to Seir, that is Edom, and then goes to Jerusalem, or to Jerusalem first and then the other parts of the earth, so that every eye shall see him, and at once, that is, just like we read in Revelation 1:7 concerning his second coming? Let us remember that Yeshua is omnipresent, and at the second coming, all evil, all wars will be instantaneously stopped everywhere in the world, as everyone will see him together. As for the chronology, it seems that we are brought to another dimension of time, and we can at least begin to perceive that it all happened at the same time. But why the south? Why Edom is here mentioned in relation to the second coming? This may very well be related to where God will hide the remnant of Israel from the devil in the tribulation time. We learn this from Revelation 12, that in the tribulation time there will be so much persecution against Israel that God will hide the remnant of Israel. Verse 6 to 9 of Revelation 12 brings us in the midst of these times where God hides the woman who is Israel before Satan is thrown on the earth. Just look at verse 6. It says, Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Where is she going to flee? Perhaps south. And this is confirmed by the words of Yeshua in Matthew 24. This is where we read in verses 15 to 16.
Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains.
Must flee to the mountains. The mountains are those right south of Jerusalem, the Judean mountains, very easily accessible the moment you leave the city of Jerusalem. You see them. So when Yeshua comes, it is possible that he may first come in the area of Bozrah to deliver the remnant and then go on to Jerusalem. That is why when speaking of the end time prophecies, we need to gather all information spread out throughout the scriptures to get a fuller perspective. And speaking of Petra, which is also in Edom, today some believers, when visiting Petra or Bozrah, put Bibles in the crevices of the rocks, hoping that one of the remnant will find it there. Then, these are ways which show we care for the future remnant, of course. Now, considering all this, what a revelation this must have been for Moses, to see the Lord coming with all the angels to save Israel. What an encouragement to see the true Redeemer finally coming in all his glory. And it is after this great experience that Moses begins stating the blessings for each of the tribes of Israel, seeing them as they will be actually in the Messianic times. Now that he knows that the Jewish people will enter the Messianic times, the millennium, and be blessed of God, he now goes and mentions the tribes of Israel and tells us that where they will be placed. It is in verse 6 when Moses begins with the oldest son, that is Reuben, oldest son of Jacob. Of him he says, "Let Reuben live and not die, nor let his men be few." Why did he say this of Reuben? When previously Jacob mentioned Reuben in his prophetic utterance in Genesis 49 for the 12 tribes of Israel, he did not put Reuben in a favorable light. Jacob described Reuben as he was then and spoke of the grave sin he committed, whose consequences followed him and his tribe throughout the history of Israel. We read in Genesis 49:4 concerning Reuben, he says he is unstable as water. He says, "You shall not excel." So Reuben actually committed a grave sin, and as a consequence, he lost the blessings of the firstborn. He lost the double inheritance, which actually went to Joseph. Such potential blessings were in store for Reuben, yet we read how throughout history again this tribe showed weakness and instability at different moments. But this was past. And Moses, surely aware of this history, sees him now fully reestablished in the Messianic times. "Let Reuben live and not die, nor let this man be few." This is not a prayer, it's a blessing, a reversal, considering all that he did and what his future actions would be. Now, the next one to have been mentioned is Judah, from whom the Messiah was to come, as Jacob said in Genesis 49. And here we read in verse 7 of Deuteronomy, the only thing that Moses mentioned about Judah actually is short but very revealing. Verse 7.
And this he said of Judah, "Hear, Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him to his people. Let his hands be sufficient for him, and may you be a help against his enemies."
There are two individuals in this verse. Now, first, the voice of Judah is understood to be the prayers, of course, of the kings of Israel, and especially those of David as he wrote them in the book of Psalms. As for the rest of the prophecy, it's not easy to figure out. Notice the him in the verse. Who is the him who is brought to the people of Judah? The Targum of Jerusalem understood that it was actually speaking of Shimeon, who actually is not listed at all in this list and was given a territory within the tribe of Judah. But since it is the tribe of Judah from whom the Messiah was to come, as Jacob indicates, here Moses is primarily referring to the Messiah, to his rejection perhaps by Israel, and praise. Bring him to his people because he's the one who will restore Israel. He just saw him in his second coming. Now he prays that the Jewish people will see and recognize him before he comes back. And he says that is, let his hand be sufficient for him, that is, the hand of the Messiah be sufficient for Judah, for Israel. Moses then may have seen the first and second coming of the Messiah here. Next, he mentions Levi, the tribe Moses himself belonged to, and he rejoices over the fact that they kept their status as the priestly nation. See verse 10.
They shall teach Jacob your judgments, and Israel your law. They shall put incense before you, and a whole burnt sacrifice on your altar.
Moses was certainly referring to the sacrifices in the millennium at the temple in Jerusalem, and even beyond in the eternal state. Of course, there would be no sacrifices there, but perhaps he saw this place as the nation of Israel, along with the other nation, will be in heaven forever, as we read in Revelation 21 and 22. And next, he mentions Benjamin, Mordechai and Paul's tribe, and there he pronounces these words in verse 12.
Of Benjamin he said, "The beloved of the Lord shall dwell in safety by him, who shelters him all the day long, and he shall dwell between his shoulders."
Now, why these blessings on Benjamin? You know, the history of the tribe of Benjamin contains a sad record of civil war in which they were engaged with war with the other tribes of Israel. At one point in history, they were almost exterminated. But at the very end, Moses rejoices over the fact that this tribe shall dwell in safety by him, by the Lord. This is how they will be in the future. Next, he mentions Joseph and gives a lengthy blessing. Joseph is the firstborn of Rachel. While Joseph is not the firstborn of the sons of Israel, he's yet the firstborn of Rachel, the woman that Jacob went for. This is why he's giving the blessings of the firstborn. He gets a double inheritance. His inheritance could be seen in his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, two large tribes of Israel. They are mentioned actually in verse 17.
His glory is like a firstborn bull, and his horns like the horns of the wild ox. Together with them he shall push the peoples to the ends of the earth. They are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh.
See, there is no tribe of Joseph per se, but there are two to replace it. That is of his two sons, and a great blessing follows in verses 30. In these verses, that is, Manasseh and Ephraim were born of an Egyptian woman, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. Eventually, one of them, Ephraim, became one of the most powerful of all the tribes. In fact, when Israel was divided into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom was named Ephraim, and southern kingdom Judah. Ephraim became the one name representing the 10 tribes of the north. The next one Moses mentions are two tribes, Zebulun and Issachar. And there he says something quite interesting. Look at verse 18 to 19.
And of Zebulun he said, Rejoice, Zebulun, in your going out, and Issachar in your tents. They shall call the peoples to the mountain. There they shall offer sacrifices of righteousness, for they shall partake of the abundance of the seas and of treasures hidden in the sand.
See, in verse 19, we see that they will partake in the abundance of the sea and they will have treasures in the sand. We read the sea and sand. But if you see a map, okay, of the 12 tribes of Israel, you will see that the two tribes are not located by the seashore. However, if you see another map, the map of the tribes of Israel in the Messianic times, they have been placed right where the sea is, right at the shore of the sea. This confirms that Moses saw the tribes as they will be in the future in the Messianic times. And next we read of the tribes of Gad.
And of Gad he said, Blessed is he who enlarges Gad. He dwells as a lion and tears the arm and the crown of his head.
You see, Go ahead, Sharon.
He provided the first part for himself, because a lawgiver's portion was reserved there. He came with the heads of the people. He administered the justice of the Lord and his judgments with Israel.
Thank you. You see, Gad was living in a very, very hostile territory. And because of that, we're told in Judges chapter 10 that they grew to be warlike and fierce. We're told in 1 Chronicle 12 that they were strong and mighty men whose faces were like those of lions. Elijah, by the way, was from the tribe of Gad. And so Moses sees what this tribe did for Israel and states how she will be rewarded in the Messianic times. And then we read about the tribe of Dan, verse 22.
And of Dan he said, Dan is a lion's whelp, he shall leap from Bashan.
Dan was one actually of the worst tribe of Israel. It is the tribe that introduced idolatry into Israel, northern Israel. This might very well be why it is not mentioned within the 144,000 in Revelation chapter 7. Even Jacob, when speaking of the tribe, this tribe that is in Genesis 49, he interrupted the flow of the prophetic speech, and when he came to Dan and pronounced what looks like a prayer. See what he says in Genesis 49, 17, 18.
Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels, so that its rider shall fall backward. I have waited for your salvation, O Lord.
I have waited for your salvation, O Lord. This comes abruptly. Why this interruption in Genesis? It is possible that Jacob saw the future of Dan in history, and as a father who sees a sad future of his sons, calls on God for speedy salvation. And to this, Moses answers in Deuteronomy 33:22 of Dan, he said, Dan as a lion whelp, he shall leap from Bashan. In the millennium, he shall leap from Bashan. Previously, Dan was in the south. In the millennium, actually, he would be in Bashan. This is a very fertile land, and it became the bread basket of the region. And this reestablishment of Dan is a refreshing news, since that tribe was in the Old Testament, decreasing in number and always mentioned last in the lists. Dan was the last one to receive the land, in fact, but it would be reestablished. And the last tribes which are mentioned are two beautiful tribes, Naphtali and Asher, in verses 23 and 24.
And of Naphtali he said, O Naphtali, satisfied with favor, and full of the blessing of the Lord, possess the west and the south. And of Asher he said, Asher is most blessed of sons. Let him be favored by his brothers, and let him dip his foot in oil.
Oil, as in olive oil, like great blessings from the Lord. Apparently, do you know that some went to dig in for oil, trying to discover oils for cars, but of course they didn't find anything. But these two tribes will be richly blessed in the Messianic times. In fact, the name Asher means blessed. But there's something really beautiful about the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. We can see the history actually of redemption when you see the meaning of their names. When you put them together, a path comes out. It is the same path anyone who comes to believe in Yeshua is actually following. Their lives from beginning to the end is a great type of the salvation we have. Let's look at their names. And let's include also Shimeon in there, for he is also an important link to this path. Reuben, the first one, means I see a son. Whose son do you see before salvation? It is the Son of God, the Messiah himself. And after, you see Shimeon. Shimeon means to hear. The reception of the gospel comes by faith, and faith comes by hearing, and hearing the word of God, as it is written in Romans 10:17. You see, you hear, and what happens when you hear and believe? You become Levi. Levi means to join. You are joined to the Lord. We see the same process in Ephesians 1:13, where Paul says, in him you also trusted after you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation. In him, in whom also, having believed, you were sealed by the Holy Spirit of God. You trusted Reuben, you heard Shimeon, and you are sealed, Levi. And you are joined through the Spirit of God. And it is at this time that you can truly, Judah. Judah means to praise. A new life begins in the believer, and this is expressed in joyous worship and praises. And it is at this time that we can perceive the process of sanctification beginning, where the believers becomes Dan. Dan means really to judge. Once a believer, in his sanctification, he is called to judge himself in this process of cleansing, because we're going through a process of cleansing. And we know that this process, it's not easy. It is Naphtali. Naphtali means fighting. It means to wrestle. This fighting speaks of our constant battle against sin. It speaks of our growth. When Rachel had Naphtali, she said in Genesis chapter 30, verse 8, with great wrestling I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. But you see, the Hebrew is somewhat different. The word great in this verse is actually the name of God, Elohim. I do not know what they translated as great here. So the Hebrew reads something like, with Elohim and with my sister I wrestled and have prevailed. Does that sound familiar? Rachel, like her husband Jacob, fought this man and God and prevailed. Remember Genesis 32:28, when God changed the name of Jacob to Israel. He says to him, and your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with man and have prevailed. Jacob and Rachel wrestled with God, it seems, and prevailed. So did the 12 tribes. So does everyone who comes to a saving knowledge of Yeshua. And so we are all Naphtali. Naphtali. And what happens in the process? We become Gad. Gad means a troop, means a company. This speaks of fellowship. It speaks of the congregation. By then the believer belongs to the body of the Messiah in fellowship in the Lord and with the Lord's people, because this is the place of Asher. Asher means blessing, and this is where one is truly blessed, in the word and in fellowship, and when the Lord, where the Lord, that is, leads him or her to great heights. In fact, this is where he becomes Issachar. Issachar means wages, recompense. Usually one gets wages after a work done. This may very well speak of the believer's rewards for services rendered to the Lord. And it is through Gad, through the congregation, where the Asher and the Issachar comes, receive the blessing and reward. And this is where we are Zebulon. Zebulon in Hebrew means exalted, exalted, as the believer will be when the Lord comes back. And it is at this time that when we are all Joseph, Joseph, which means adding, it speaks of rewards which he will be given to those who also serve diligently and faithfully. Okay, more than just reward, it will be added above the rewards. And finally, this is when we come to Benjamin. Benjamin means the son of my right hand. This will be the time when we will be forever and ever in heaven. I understand that I went very fast over these names, but this study is recorded and you can always go back in the video and listen to it again. And so, through their names, the tribes of Israel are a great testimony to us, and it is not for nothing that their names will be engraved on the gates of heaven for eternity. See what Revelation 21:12 says. And it had great wall and high walls, and had 12 gates, speaking of the New Jerusalem, and at the gates 12 angels, and names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. You know, the pearl here reminds us of the suffering of the Messiah. And on the pearl will be written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. This was also to show their suffering, the suffering of Israel as well. As she suffered because they were the chosen people. They still are, of course, the chosen people. Their names then will remind us of their suffering in our walk on earth. That is when we'll be in heaven, when we'll come in and out of heaven, we will see these gates. And as Moses blessed the 12 tribes, and as he saw their latter ends, I am sure that he was more than encouraged. And this you can see, you can feel in what he says at the end of this chapter. They are in fact the last words of Moses, beginning in verse 26. This is what he says.
There is no one like the God of Yerushun, who rides the heavens to help you, and in his excellency on the clouds. The eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. He will thrust out the enemy from before you and will say, destroy.
What a great relief and delight and encouragement it must have been for Moses to realize that his work was not in vain, and that the people that he loved so much will at the end dwell safely in the promised land. But God does not stop here. As we read in Psalm 116:15, precious is in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Here God is about to perform another miracle, a few more miracles. Last personal miracles for Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. While God did not allow Moses to enter the land, in the next chapter, the last one, he actually gives the man a tour of the whole land of Israel, and without Moses moving 1 inch. See Deuteronomy 34, beginning with verse 1. I will show you a map as we read these verses. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is across from Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead as far as Dan. So Moses was standing around where the red star is in the map, if you can see the video. The plains of Moab, Mount Nebo, and the top of Pisgah were around where he was. Then God showed him Gilead as far as Dan. This is where the miracle happens. Where is Gilead as far as Dan? Very much north. It was very far from where Moses was standing, but having God as his personal guide, Moses saw it all. But this is not all. The verse also says that Moses saw all of Naphtali and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh and the land of Judah as far as the western sea. Moses' sight was even enlarged, even more enlarged, as God allows him to see all of Naphtali and Ephraim and Manasseh and Judah as well. And this is not all. He asked Moses to look to his left and behind him. And he says the south and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. And then the Lord said to him in verse 4, this is the land on which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendant. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there. And so this book ends with a great miracle, great miracles. How could Moses see such a vastness from where he was standing? It is impossible to see it all, but with God, all things are possible. And here God performs this last miracle for Moses personally. That says a lot. That says a lot. And truly, Moses is not the only recipient of this great miracle. What that tells us is that God is a God of encouragement. That tells us that our great and awesome God really values his workers. He values every work you do for him. Not only did he give Moses an opportunity to see the fruit of his labor, but also to see the whole land better than if he entered it really. This is how the Lord leaves us at the end of Deuteronomy, with a great message of encouragement. May the Lord bless you all.
Hallelujah, Adonai, kol goyim. Shabechu kol ha'umim. גפר עלינו חסדו, ואמת אדוני לעולם, הללויה, הללויה. כי גפר עלינו חסדו, ואמת אדוני לעולם, הללויה, הללויה, הללויה. Adonai kol goyim, hallelujah, Adonai kol goyim,